temperature-controlled vault inside Yale University's Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library in New Haven, Connecticut, there sits a small book that has defeated every brilliant mind that has ever touched it. It defeated William Friedman, the man widely considered the greatest codebreaker in American history, the man who cracked the Japanese military cipher known as Purple during the Second World War. It defeated the founding cryptanalysts of the National Security Agency. It defeated British intelligence officers who had broken Nazi spy networks during the bloodiest conflict the world had ever seen. And in the early months of 2026, something finally happened that nobody in the academic world was prepared for. Not a clean answer. Something far stranger than that. Welcome to Hushed History, and I want you to find a place where you can fully relax and let the outside world fade away into the background as you get comfortable for the story I am about to share with you tonight. To understand what is happening right now, you first need to understand what this mystery actually is. Because most people who hear the name assume they already know. They do not. The Voynich Manuscript is not simply an old book written in a lost language. It is something that has forced serious academics, serious scientists, and serious codebreakers to ask a question they find deeply uncomfortable. What if it was never meant to be read at all? Let us start at the beginning. Sometime between the 4th of January 1404 and the 31st of December 1438, a hand-pressed quill to calfskin vellum in Central Europe and began to write. We do not know the city. We do not know the name. We do not even know with certainty whether it was one person or several. What we do know is that the hand was trained. The strokes are consistent, flowing, and practiced in the way that only comes from years of deliberate repetition. This was not someone experimenting. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The book is modest in size, roughly 9 inches by 6, close to a modern paperback. But inside those quiet dimensions, something extraordinary was laid down across approximately 240 pages of fine calfskin. There are illustrations of plants that do not exist in nature, not species that have gone extinct, not specimens that have yet to be classified. could not exist. The roots of one species fused to the leaves of another, with flowers from a third blooming somewhere in the middle. Not a single botanist in the 600 years since this book was made has looked at those drawings and said with any confidence, "I know what this is." There are astronomical diagrams, circles within circles, marked with symbols and inscriptions in the same unreadable script that fills every other page. The positions of the celestial bodies in those diagrams do not correspond to any known star chart from any known civilization. There are zodiac symbols drawn in ways that are subtly but unmistakably wrong by the conventions of the period. There are pages filled with small naked figures, dozens of them, bathing in channels and pools of blue and green liquid that flows through elaborate pipe systems connecting basin to basin. Nobody knows what those pages represent. Nobody has ever known. And then there is the text. $170,000 individual glyphs arranged into what look like words, then sentences, then paragraphs. The script runs left to right, which places it within a broadly European tradition. The letter shapes repeat with the regularity of a natural alphabet. The word lengths fall within the statistical ranges you would expect from human speech. There is something that looks like grammar, something that looks like syntax, something that looks at every level of surface examination like a real language being used by a real person to say something real. And yet, in 600 years, no linguist, no cryptographer, and no computer scientist has ever been able to read a single sentence of it. This is the detail that people struggle to truly absorb when they first encounter this story. It is not that the language is obscure or regional. It is not simply that the alphabet is unfamiliar. It is that the text, despite behaving on the surface like language, refuses at every deeper level of analysis to resolve into meaning. It sits permanently at the edge of comprehension, just close enough to feel solvable, just far enough away to remain untouched. The manuscript's documented history begins in the 17th century. Its earliest confirmed owner was a Prague alchemist named Georg Bersch. Bersch spent years studying the pages. he got nowhere. In 1637, he made copies of some of the glyphs and sent them to Athanasius Kircher in Rome, a Jesuit scholar who was considered one of the foremost authorities on ancient and obscure languages anywhere in the world. Kircher could not read it either. He was reportedly so fascinated that he tried to purchase the manuscript from Berge. Berge refused to sell. After Berge died, the book passed to his friend Jan Merck Marsai, who sent it on to Kircher along with a letter. That letter is one of the most tantalizing documents in the entire history of this mystery. In it, Marsai relays a story he had been told about the manuscript's earlier life. A story about how Rudolph II, the Holy Roman Emperor, a man who ruled over much of Europe in the final decades of the 1500s and who was consumed by his fascination with the occult and the arcane, had once paid 600 gold ducats for this very book. That is the equivalent of roughly £90,000 in today's money. Rudolph, according to the letter, believed the manuscript had been written by the 13th century English philosopher Roger Bacon, a man so far ahead of his era that contemporaries whispered he must have access to knowledge from sources that could not be explained. We now know that is impossible. Carbon dating of the vellum, carried out by the University of Arizona and confirmed to a 95% probability, places the creation of the pages firmly between 1404 and 1438. Roger Bacon died on the 9th of June, 1292. The pages do not go back far enough. They cannot be his. But the fact that one of the most powerful rulers in European history paid a small fortune for this book and believed it contained knowledge beyond ordinary human understanding tells us something important about the effect this object has on people who encounter it. From the very beginning, it has made rational people feel that what they are holding is more than it appears. The trail goes cold after Kircher receives the book in the 1660s. For the next 250 years, it disappears almost entirely from the historical record. It surfaces again in 1912 in a chest of books being sold off by a Jesuit college in the town of Frascati near Rome. The man who opened that chest was a Polish book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich. And by every account available to us, the moment Wilfrid Voynich held that book in his hands, something changed in him. He spent the last 18 years of his life trying to decode it. He died on the 19th of March, 1930, without a single answer. The manuscript now bears his name. After his death, the book passed through several pairs of hands and arrived in 1969 at the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University, where it has remained ever since under the catalog number Beinecke MS 408. In any given year, more than 10% of all visits to the Beinecke Library website are people coming specifically to look at this one book. Close to 50% of all visits to the library's digital image viewer are people zooming into its pages, studying those flowing and maddeningly consistent glyphs, searching for the thing that every person who has ever looked has searched for: the key, the crack in the surface, the moment where the pattern suddenly becomes legible. Nobody has ever found it. In the 20th century, the people who came closest were not enthusiastic amateurs working at kitchen tables. They were professional cryptanalysts at the peak of their abilities. William Friedman, who cracked Japan's purple cipher during the Second World War and went on to lead cryptanalysis at the National Security Agency, spent decades working on the Voynich Manuscript. He assembled what is considered the largest private archive of Voynich research material ever collected. He formed a dedicated study group that met regularly at Arlington Hall in Virginia. He died on the 2nd of November, 1969. He never decoded a single word. His wife, Elizabeth Friedman, who had independently dismantled Nazi spy networks operating in South America during the war, also worked on the manuscript. She too left without answers. John Tiltman, one of the most celebrated cryptanalysts in the history of British intelligence, described the Voynich Manuscript as the most baffling problem he had ever encountered in a career built entirely around the impossible. Then came the age of computers, and everyone assumed that would end it. In 1994, the manuscript was digitized for the first time and made available to researchers. In 2004, the Beinecke Library published high-resolution scans of every page online. Research teams from universities across the world ran statistical analyses. Computational linguists applied pattern recognition software. Neural networks were trained on the text. Each time, the initial results suggested momentum. Each time, the deeper the analysis went, the stranger things became. The text behaved like language on the surface. Beneath the surface, it behaved like nothing anyone had encountered before. Here is the detail that changed how researchers thought about the problem. Every natural language ever studied follows a mathematical rule called Zipf's law, which describes how frequently common words repeat relative to rare ones. The Voynich text follows some of those patterns, but not all of them. It follows them in some sections and violates them in others, in ways that appear almost deliberate. In ways that suggest whoever produced this text understood which statistical patterns a real language creates, and knew precisely which ones to mimic and which ones to break. That is either an extraordinary coincidence, or it is evidence of something very calculated indeed. By the middle years of the 2000s, the central question driving academic research had quietly shifted. It was no longer simply, what does this say? It had become, is there anything here to say at all? And that question was about to be answered in a way nobody anticipated. Not by a codebreaker, not by a linguist, not by a historian, by an artificial intelligence trained on 37 million historical texts. And by an independent researcher who sat alone in his study with a deck of playing cards, a pair of dice, and a journal called Cryptologia. What they found did not unlock the manuscript, but it changed everything about what the manuscript might actually be. And that is where we are going next. Most people who know of the Voynich Manuscript think of it as a single, impenetrable block of unknown text. But the people who have spent their professional lives studying it know that it is far more complicated than that, and far more disturbing. The largest section is the herbal. "126 pages, each one dominated by a drawing of a plant, accompanied by dense paragraphs of Voynichese text arranged carefully around the illustration. The format mirrors exactly what you would expect from a medieval botanical reference, the kind of compendium a physician or an apothecary might consult. except for one detail. Not one of the 113 plants depicted in those pages has ever been identified as a real species. Not one. Botanists have examined these drawings for generations. Some pages show something with the vague silhouette of a recognizable herb. But then you look more closely, and the roots belong to one genus, the leaves to another, and the flowers to a third that does not exist in any taxonomy ever recorded. They are chimeras. Botanical impossibilities rendered with the same confident draftsmanship you would find in any legitimate medieval herbal. The astronomical section runs to 17 pages. Circular diagrams, arrangements of suns and moons and stars, zodiac symbols that include a fish for Pisces, a bull for Taurus, and an archer for Sagittarius. On the surface, familiar enough. But the star positions in those charts do not correspond to the night sky as observed from any location on Earth at any point in recorded history. The constellations are unrecognizable. The names written beside individual stars in that same flowing Voynichese have never been matched to any known astronomical catalog from any culture. The biological section is the one that unsettles most people the most. Page after page of small female figures, most depicted with swollen abdomens, immersed in or wading through liquid. They are connected to each other by an elaborate system of tubes, pipes, and capsules through which colored fluid appears to flow. Researchers at Yale University's Beinecke Library, who are cautious by professional obligation, describe the section as containing drawings that interact with interconnecting tubes and capsules. What those interactions represent, what the fluid is, what the system is designed to do, remains entirely unknown. Then there are 9 large cosmological medallions, some of them drawn across multiple folded pages that unfold to reveal what appear to be geographical forms. Then a pharmaceutical section with over 100 illustrations of herbs and medicinal roots, accompanied by drawings of jars and vessels in red, blue, and green. And finally, the recipes section, pages of continuous dense text in which small star-shaped flowers mark the beginning of each separate entry. 6 sections, each coherent in its visual organization, each suggesting a different domain of knowledge, each written in the same script that nobody can read. Here is what makes this internal structure so significant. If the Voynich text were pure nonsense, pure fabrication with no underlying meaning at all, you would expect its statistical patterns to be consistent throughout. Random noise spread evenly across 240 pages. But that is not what the text does. The patterns in the herbal section are statistically different from the patterns in the astronomical section. The vocabulary clusters in the biological pages differ from those in the pharmaceutical pages. The text behaves as though it knows which section it is in. As though the writer or writers adjusted what they were writing to match the subject matter of the illustrations around it. Something that only makes sense if there is actual meaning being encoded. Something that is very difficult to explain if the whole thing is an elaborate fraud. In 1976, a United States Navy cryptographer named Prescott Currier stood up at a conference on medieval manuscripts in Washington and announced a finding that changed the study of the Voynich Manuscript permanently. Currier had been working through the text with the rigor of a professional signals analyst. And what he found was this. The manuscript is not written in one hand. It is not even written in one language. There are 2 distinct statistical systems operating within the same pages. 2 sets of character frequencies and word patterns that are sufficiently different from each other that Currier classified them separately. He called them language A and language B. Language A dominates the herbal section. Language B dominates the biological pages and the later portions of the manuscript. The handwriting shifts between them. The vocabulary shifts. The statistical behavior of the glyphs shifts. It is as though 2 separate people, each working within the same invented script, are nevertheless encoding something in subtly different ways. The implications of this were significant and uncomfortable in equal measure. the manuscript were a hoax, Currier pointed out. It was a hoax requiring the sustained, coordinated effort of at least 2 individuals across what appears to have been a substantial period of time. Both of them maintaining perfect internal consistency within their respective systems. Both of them avoiding any slip that might expose the underlying mechanism. For 600 years. That is a very demanding standard for a deception. More recent paleographic analysis has gone even further. In 2020, the medievalist Lisa Fagin Davis, executive director of the Medieval Academy of America, conducted a systematic examination of the manuscript's handwriting using digital tools unavailable to Currier's generation. Her conclusion was that not 2 but 5 distinct hands had worked on the pages. Five separate individuals, each with their own subtle variations of letter form and pen pressure and stroke angle. 5 people who all knew this script. 5 people who all wrote in it with the fluency of long practice. 5 people who have left no other trace in history. Then came the 9th of September 2024. On that date, Lisa Fagin Davis published the results of a decade's worth of work on a set of images that had been sitting in a digital archive at the Beinecke Library since 2014. In 2014, a research team from the Lazarus Project, working alongside imaging scientists from the Rochester Institute of Technology, had been granted permission to perform multispectral scans of 10 selected pages of the manuscript. Multispectral imaging exposes a document to wavelengths of light outside the visible spectrum, ultraviolet and infrared, and records what those wavelengths reveal. It has been used to read burned and blackened scrolls from Herculaneum. It has recovered erased text from documents thought lost forever. For reasons that included staff turnover, library backlog, and the disruption of the global pandemic, those Voynich scans had sat unpublished and largely unexamined for 10 years. What Fagin Davis found in them had been waiting a decade to be seen. On the opening page of the manuscript, folio 1, in the right-hand margin, hidden entirely from view under ordinary light, there were 3 columns of writing. The first column was the Roman alphabet, written from A to Z. The third column was the Roman alphabet again, but shifted by one letter. Between them, the second column was a corresponding sequence of Voynich glyphs. Someone, centuries ago, had sat with this book and done exactly what every codebreaker since has tried to do. They had attempted to map the unknown alphabet onto the known one. They had tried to build a key. Lisa Fagin Davis identified the hand as belonging to Johannes Marcus Marci, the Prague doctor who owned the manuscript between 1662 and 1665, the same man who had sent it to Athanasius Kircher with the letter about Rudolph II and Roger Bacon. Marci had tried to crack it. He had written his attempt directly onto the first page of the book. And then the attempt had faded from view and been forgotten for 3.5 centuries. His key had not worked. Nothing he found in those columns led anywhere. The model identified consistent vocabulary clusters across different sections of the manuscript. In the herbal pages, repeated word patterns behaved statistically like plant part vocabulary. Root, stem, flower. Process verbs that appeared to mean something like boil, crush, soak. In the biological section, the clustering suggested anatomical description. In the astronomical pages, word groups consistent with time and celestial measurement appeared at frequencies that were unlikely to be random. The machine was not reading the manuscript, but it was finding meaning-shaped structures within it. Structures that aligned section by section with the illustrations around them. Structures that academic linguists are still debating today. And then, in late 2025, a science journalist and independent researcher named Michael Greshko published a paper in the peer-reviewed journal Cryptologia. His approach was not computational. It was historical. He had asked a question that nobody had thought to frame quite this way before. Not, what does this text say? Not, what language is this text in? But could a person in early 15th century Central Europe have produced a text with all of these statistical properties using only materials available to them at the time? the answer he arrived at changed the terms of the entire debate. And to understand that answer, you need to understand a card game. A game played in the taverns and courtyards of northern Italy in the 1300s. A game involving a specific kind of deck. A game whose name in the Italian of that era was Naibbe. Greshko had noticed something that others had missed, or at least had not pursued this far. The Voynich text is what cryptographers call verbose. The same sound or letter, when it appears in different positions in a word, is often represented by different glyphs. This is not what you would expect from a simple substitution cipher, where each letter maps consistently to one symbol. This is what you would expect from a cipher system that deliberately introduces controlled variation, that uses randomness as part of its mechanism, specifically to frustrate exactly the kind of frequency analysis that every code breaker from William Friedman to the most sophisticated neural network of the 21st century had been applying. And the tool that would allow a 15th century writer to introduce that precise kind of controlled randomness was right there in front of anyone who thought to look. A deck of playing cards, a pair of dice. The Naibbe Cipher that Greshko designed and published works as follows. A piece of Latin or Italian text is broken into short groupings of 1 or 2 letters. The writer then draws from a deck of playing cards. The card drawn determines which of several possible substitution tables is used to convert those letters into Voynich glyphs. A roll of a die introduces a further layer of variation. The result is a text where the same source letter might be encoded differently each time it appears, depending on the card drawn, depending on the die rolled, all of it happening within a structured system that nevertheless produces output with the statistical fingerprint of a natural language. Greshko applied this cipher system to samples of medieval Latin and Italian text. The output matched the statistical properties of the Voynich Manuscript across multiple measurable dimensions simultaneously. The frequency of individual symbols, the typical length of words, the positional patterns of specific glyphs at the beginnings and ends of words, all of it matching. Playing cards had arrived in Europe from the Mamluk Sultanate in the late 1300s. By the time the Voynich vellum was being prepared, sometime between 1404 and 1438, they were widely available across northern Italy. The materials required to produce this cipher were not exotic. They were sitting on tables in ordinary homes. Greshko was careful. He stated explicitly in his paper that he was not claiming to have solved the Voynich Manuscript. He was not asserting that the Naibbe Cipher was the precise mechanism used by whoever wrote it. What he was asserting was that this kind of cipher, or something very much like it, would produce a text with exactly these properties. Which meant that the hypothesis that the Voynich manuscript is a real encoded text containing real information in a real language was not only still viable, it was now supported by a historically plausible mechanism that worked. Experts not involved in the research described it as the most rigorous framework yet produced for understanding how the manuscript could have been made. Not the final answer, but the clearest picture yet of the shape of the problem. And in a mystery that has resisted every attempt at clarity for 6 centuries, that is not a small thing. But there is a detail at the edge of all of this research that has not yet been addressed. A detail that sits quietly beneath every paper, every statistical model, every multispectral scan, every artificial intelligence result. A detail that the most sober and serious academics working on this problem acknowledge when pressed. And it is this: if the Naibbe Cipher, or something like it, was used to encode this text, then the key exists. It existed at the moment of writing. It was held in someone's hands, and it went somewhere. Somewhere in the 6 centuries, since a trained hand pressed quill to calfskin in an unknown workshop in Central Europe, the key either survived or it did not. And if it survived, it is waiting in a chest, in an archive, in a library that has not yet looked in the right place. That question and what the most recent research in 2026 suggests about where that answer might actually lie is where we are going next. Let us take stock of where we are. A book was made sometime between the 4th of January 1404 and the 31st of December 1438. It was written by at least 5 separate hands, all of them trained, all of them fluent in a script that exists nowhere else in the historical record. It passed through the court of the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, who paid 600 gold ducats for it. It was signed by his court alchemist. It was studied and failed by a 17th century Prague physician who wrote a desperate substitution key in the margin of the first page and got nowhere. It defeated the greatest codebreaker in American history. It defeated the founding cryptanalysts of the National Security Agency. It survived 2 world wars, 3 centuries of institutional silence, and the full computational force of 21st century artificial intelligence. And as of the early months of 2026, it remains unread. Not unstudyable, not unapproachable, but unread. What we know now that we did not know a decade ago is significant. We know from the multispectral work of Lisa Fagin Davis, published on the 8th of September 2024, that the manuscript is almost certainly genuine. Not a modern forgery, not a 19th century fabrication. A real medieval document produced by real people with a real purpose that they chose, for reasons we still do not understand, to conceal. We know from the paleographic analysis that 5 distinct individuals contributed to it, each with their own hand, each working within the same system. We know from the AI modeling completed in late 2025 that the text contains meaning-shaped structures that align with the illustrations around them, section by section, in ways that are extremely difficult to produce by accident. We know from Michael Greshko's Naibbe Cipher paper, published in the journal Cryptologia in late 2025, that a historically plausible mechanism exists for producing exactly this kind of text, using materials available in early 15th century northern Italy. cards and dice and structured substitution tables. Simple tools in trained hands. But there is a harder question sitting underneath all of this. A question that the new research has sharpened rather than softened. If Greshko's framework is correct, or even approximately correct, then the Voynich Manuscript is a ciphertext. A real document encoding real information in a real language, probably Latin, possibly an Italian dialect. Possibly something else entirely that shares enough structural properties with those languages to produce the same statistical output. And if it is a ciphertext, then the person who wrote it had a key, a specific set of tables, a specific deck configuration. A specific system that, if you held it in your hands, would allow you to sit down with Beinecke MS 408 and begin, for the first time in 6 centuries, to read. That key did not disappear into nothing. Objects do not vanish from history without leaving traces. They move. They are copied. They are bound into other manuscripts. They are catalogued under wrong descriptions by librarians who did not know what they were looking at. They sit in boxes in the reading rooms of archives that have not yet been asked the right question. The history of manuscript research is full of documents that were lost for centuries and then found again. The letter that Johannes Marcus Marci wrote to Athanasius Kircher in 1665, the letter that told the story of Rudolph II and Roger Bacon, was still with the manuscript when Wilfrid Voynich opened that chest in Frascati in 1912. It had traveled with the book for 250 years without being separated. Documents survive. Keys survive. The question is not whether the Voynich key exists somewhere in the archival record of 15th and 16th century Europe. The question is whether anyone has looked in the right place. The answer, as of 2026, is that nobody has looked systematically. The computational resources now available to historical linguistics had not, until very recently, been applied to the question of the key rather than the question of the text. That is changing. The same transformer models that identified botanical and anatomical vocabulary clusters in the Voynich pages are now being used to search for matching structural patterns in digitized collections of medieval European manuscripts. The Bodleian Library in Oxford, the Biblioteca Medicia Lorenziana in Florence, the Archivio di Stato in Venice, collections that contain hundreds of thousands of pages from precisely the period and region where the Voynich vellum was prepared. If the key exists in any of those collections and was encoded or disguised in a way consistent with the Naibbe framework, the models being developed right now have a realistic chance of finding it. Not a guaranteed chance. Not an imminent announcement. But a real and grounded possibility of the kind that has not existed at any previous point in the 600-year history of this mystery. There is one more thread that has not yet been pulled. In 2024, researchers Keegan Brewer and Michelle Lewis published a paper in the academic journal Social History of Medicine proposing that the Voynich Manuscript is, at its core, a medical text. Specifically, a text about women's health, conception, and gynecological practice. Their argument was grounded not in the script, but in the illustrations. The bathing figures in the biological section they proposed are not symbolic representations of some arcane cosmological process. They are diagrams of the female reproductive system. The tubes and capsules and flowing liquids are anatomical. The pools are not baths. They are schematic representations of biological processes that a physician working in early 15th century northern Italy would have had professional reasons to record and very specific reasons to conceal. Reasons that had nothing to do with mysticism and everything to do with the religious and social climate of the time. Medical knowledge concerning female reproduction, gynecological treatment, and anything that touched on conception or its prevention was dangerous knowledge in medieval Europe. It was the kind of knowledge that had been encoded, abbreviated, and deliberately obscured in manuscripts across the continent for precisely this reason. Brewer and Lewis found a 21-line cipher from late medieval northern Italy, discovered during their research into related documents that obscured a recipe with gynecological uses, including the management of pregnancy. They did not claim to have translated the Voynich text. They claimed to have identified a context. A world in which the specific combination of botanical knowledge, anatomical diagrams, astronomical cycles, and pharmaceutical instruction would all have belonged to the same professional practice. And in which the person who assembled that knowledge would have had powerful incentive to make it unreadable to anyone who should not have access to it. That context, combined with the Naibbe Cipher framework, combined with the AI vocabulary clustering, combined with the multispectral confirmation of authenticity, produces for the first time something approaching a coherent picture. A physician, or a small group of physicians working somewhere in northern Italy in the early decades of the 1400s, assembled a practical medical compendium. Botanical, astronomical, pharmaceutical, anatomical. The kind of reference a working practitioner would need. They encoded it using a card and dice substitution system into a script of their own devising. They distributed the work of copying it across at least 5 scribes. They produced a book that was internally consistent, statistically sophisticated, and completely opaque to anyone who did not hold the key. At some point, the book was separated from its key. At some point, the people who could read it were gone. And the book traveled on alone through the courts of emperors and the libraries of Jesuit colleges and the hands of desperate, brilliant people who stared at it for decades and died without a word. That is the most plausible reconstruction of the Voynich Manuscript that the evidence of 2026 supports. It is not a certainty. It is a framework, and it may be wrong. Because the history of this manuscript is also a history of frameworks that seemed convincing and then collapsed. Nicholas Gibbs announced in 2017 that the text was abbreviated Latin, encoding a women's health manual. Professional cryptographers and linguists dismantled his method within weeks. An AI had identified the underlying language as Hebrew written with altered letter order. That too did not survive scrutiny. There have been solutions in 2019 and 2023, each one greeted with initial excitement, each one quietly set aside. The Voynich Manuscript has a long history of making people believe they have found the answer, and then taking it back. So we arrive at 2026 with this. The most sophisticated tools in the history of cryptography and linguistics have been applied to a small, unassuming book in a temperature-controlled vault in New Haven, Connecticut. Those tools have produced the most detailed and grounded picture yet of what that book might be and how it might have been made. Peer-reviewed research published in reputable academic journals supports a coherent hypothesis that has not yet been broken. Artificial intelligence trained on tens of millions of historical texts has identified internal structures that align with real categories of medieval knowledge. A historically plausible encryption mechanism has been demonstrated to produce output matching the manuscript's statistical properties. Multispectral imaging has confirmed the document's authenticity and recovered details invisible for 3.5 centuries. And the question of the key, the one piece that would turn all of this from hypothesis into answer, has for the first time been framed in a way that modern computational search methods can actually pursue. We are closer than we have ever been, and the book is still not open. 170,000 glyphs, 6 sections, 5 hands, 600 years. Whatever is written in those pages has outlasted every civilization that tried to read it. It has outlasted the Holy Roman Empire that paid for it. It has outlasted the Jesuit college that stored it. It has outlasted the man whose name it bears. It is sitting in a vault in Yale right now, behind climate-controlled glass, on a shelf with a catalog number, waiting. The question it has been asking for 6 centuries has not changed. Can you read me? The answer for now remains the same. Not yet. If this investigation has done what we hoped it would, you are sitting somewhere right now feeling the particular unease that only the genuinely unsolved can produce. Not the unease of horror, the unease of a door that that is very nearly open. A key that exists somewhere in an archive in Florence or Oxford or Venice, possibly misfiled, possibly misidentified, possibly one question away from being found. That feeling is the reason this channel exists. There are stories like this one everywhere in the historical record, mysteries that the passage of time has buried but not erased, questions that modern tools are only now becoming capable of asking properly. If you want to be here when the next one surfaces, and there will be a next one, then consider subscribing to Hushed History and leaving us a like so that others who share that same need to know can find their way to these investigations. We will be here, waiting the same as you, for the door to open